Adam Sandler is mainly known for his unusual array of comedy movies, to put things politely. There are some I genuinely consider to be good films, even though nowadays he is typecast as Hollywood's unfunny buffoon. Get off the phone, you psycho! Outside of comedies, there are a select number of his films that I would wholeheartedly recommend where he delivers on expectations nobody seems to have, where he actually goes on to prove that he can act. And I was recently discussing Sandler with a few friends, and I mentioned this obscure film from 2007, Reign Over Me, and it's been at least 10 years since I've actually watched it, and with the vague sequences I recalled, I felt it was definitely worth revisiting, and I'm very glad that I did. This film is written and directed by Mike Binder, and is a very heart-wrenching case study, looking at a man plagued by tragedy. And this film makes reference to the 9/11 terrorist attack where Charlie Feynman, played by Sandler, is a shell of the man that he once was. And we come to learn as the film continues that Charlie's family was killed in the attack, where he lost his wife, 3 daughters, and even the family dog. Now he's estranged from the world, where this deep look into post-traumatic stress disorder is one of the most harrowing I've seen on screen. Genuinely, I would argue this is one of Sandler's best performances ever. There's still the typical shrieking and screaming he is known for, but in context, some of these scenes are just utterly heartbreaking. With this in mind, I love how the film takes advantage of Sandler's usual acting tropes, shall we call them, where in a lot of his movies he does come off as an aggressive fool, but this time around it allows him to turn that on its head and use it to his advantage to bring out this childlike vulnerability. And the character of Charlie Feynman often struggles to compose himself to contain his emotions with various outbursts of aggression, and processing grief is one thing, but seeing how this is so damaging to those around him becomes a consistent theme, especially when an old friend gets back in touch unexpectedly after many years apart. And this is where we are introduced to his old college roommate Alan Johnson, played by Don Cheadle. And both men attended the same dental school together, where Alan became a fully fledged dentist. For Charlie, however, that's all in the past, and I like their first shared scene, how Alan stumbles across a very hesitant Charlie, who doesn't even recognize his longtime friend. Even from the body language, you can understand the discomfort this man is going through, and when he's encouraged to go out and catch up over coffee, this is where a new form of friendship begins. Although comedic at times, this friendship does take some unusual turns. Alan is frequently forced to remind his distant friend about their past, which is good for the story. It gives us as the audience more exposition about these characters, and it's kind of left somewhat ambiguous as to what Charlie does and does not remember. He appears to be choosing what memories to retain and share, especially about the tragedy that befell him. Family is a key theme, and when looking at Alan and his wife Janine, played by Jada Pinkett Smith, hanging out with Charlie starts to put a strain on his marriage, where he also shows signs of struggling to open up about his life outside of the house. This is most evident where Alan is treating a patient, Donna, played by Saffron Burrows, who decides she wants to sexually satisfy him. And for obvious reasons, this sequence is made to be extremely awkward, especially when she tries to apologize for her actions in later scenes. And even though this part of the story does work for its intended purpose, I felt it was very forced to give a potential love interest to Charlie, where both are made out to be crazy people who struggle with their emotions, and when Charlie comes across this woman, he is very conflicted about his feelings. He's very cautious about who he lets into his life, and I really like the ideas surrounding how he finds this woman physically attractive, but also fears her at the same time, and Charlie's downfall is mostly related to trust issues. I felt a lot of the scenes were written around the idea of self-destruction, and like I mentioned before, he's a shell of the man that he once was, struggling to find himself. He continues living his own life in his little world with the walls built up high around him. When in his world, he finds solace in things such as music, collecting records, and playing instruments, and he blocks out the world literally with headphones on. and you can interpret this as his own sense of freedom. A main plotline is spent trying to get Charlie to open up about his feelings, and as expected, a lot of these methods fail miserably. It begins with simple conversation, when on a night out at a club, Alan mentions how Charlie is now single, with no family to hold him back from all the girls, and this was an instant trigger where he denies even having a family to begin with. He yells at his friend in public and even throws a drink in his face, which is enough to disrupt their friendship temporarily. And although somewhat amusing, the feelings of embarrassment are just uncanny. It's a relatable situation, saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, which is then taken to the extreme for the purposes of this film. After a handful of interesting confrontations, the two bounce back to being friends again. And personally, I really like the ideas that are brought up in conversation about why Charlie wants to be Alan's friend. And that's because he finds him to be a safe person to hang around with because he doesn't know anything about his previous family life. When other people bring up his past, such as his in-laws, he can't bear to face it, he runs away. But Alan is different. And this is where I feel scenes such as Charlie being manipulated by Alan into talking about his past, even though it sounds sinister, I interpret this as a form of tough love. Whilst the two friends are looking in a record shop, a man called Nigel recognizes Alan and they begin to catch up like old friends, but something seems really off about this. Charlie is hesitant to basically pretends that Nigel doesn't even exist, and he even unsubtly resorts to name-calling, but eventually the three of them do go out for lunch, only for Charlie to recognize what is happening.
And what are you, Nigel? A therapist? Is that it?
Friend.
Ah, bullshit. You stink like a shrink.
It turns out that Nigel was a therapist hired to try and get Charlie talking, and I honestly love how cruel this situation becomes, mostly because of how Charlie is so quick to figure out what's going on. He's able to call both of them out on their bullshit, even though he is consistently in a vulnerable state. It shows that he won't be taken for a fool. And this is where he breaks down and wants to try and get help. And when asking Alan for guidance, coincidentally, Alan is friends with a therapist, Angela, played by Liv Tyler. Charlie has several counselling sessions, but they don't really go anywhere. He doesn't open up to her until he finally pushes himself to share his story with somebody, of course that person being Alan. And this is where he has a full breakdown and relives the trauma, leading to some very intense and disorderly behaviour. While opening up boxes in his apartment, he locates a gun, and while standing in front of two police officers, he threatens a taxi driver with the goal of being shot and killed by law enforcement. And this was a crazy scene where he softly says under his breath, "Do it."
Come on, do it.
Where are you?
Do it.
And this sequence I found to be very upsetting, where we see the blank look in his eyes with the intent of getting killed to just stop the pain and suffering. I think Sandler's acting peaks during the courtroom scenes where his disorderly actions allow society to view him as a danger, where healthcare professionals want to keep him under observation for at least a year. And when the case goes to trial, Charlie's vulnerable nature is at its most conspicuous. Ascertaining where the trauma is coming from, the court publicly discuss the tragedy, which even includes sharing photos of his deceased loved ones, and this pushes Charlie too far where he has a complete emotional breakdown. And I found this sequence extremely evocative, especially the disrespect from BJ Novak's character, who intentionally causes emotional harm to Charlie Feynman. And ironically, this backfires where the judge takes pity on Charlie's situation, and he grants that Charlie is still to get the help that he needs, but his freedom is not to be taken away. This ending is bittersweet in my opinion, where there's no real resolution to Charlie's trauma, but you can see steps are being taken to help him in this time of crisis. And I love the end sequence where he finally stands up to his in-laws and is able to express his feelings about the loss and why he has been behaving in such a manner. And with the help of Alan, he moves into a new apartment, and there's even hope for a potential romance, where Donna continues to be a supportive figure in his life following the courtroom scenes. Overall, I'm glad that I did revisit this movie. Even though it is very memorable, A lot of the core enjoyment comes from the range of acting, and Sandler proves there is more to him as an actor, and I feel it's a tragedy that he didn't participate in more drama-based movies to explore that range. In terms of this film, there is a lot of conversational topics to look at, such as personal trauma, how PTSD affecting one individual can be shared amongst many, and I felt a huge takeaway from this movie related to how people don't need to hold on to their problems to the point of self-destruction. You can take cliches quite literally, such as sharing is caring, a problem shared is a problem halved, and there is some truth behind that. Of course, sharing is not necessarily for everybody, but at least trying, wanting to help one's self-preservation. That's a very relatable topic I think we can all agree upon that makes us feel more human. And on that note, that's going to do it for this review looking at the movie Reign Over Me. I hope you enjoyed. Fingers crossed this time around I can keep this video series going a little bit longer. I had this idea a while ago, reviewing at least one movie a week, just to vary the discussion topics on the channel. So we'll see how things go, but let me know in the comments if you've checked out this movie before, what did you think of it? And of course, for more content, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, DVD Review Studios.
Are you threatening me?